Hello, and welcome to Transforming Worlds. In today's episode, we talk to Professor Matt Duerden. Matt is the Department Chair of Experience Design and Management in the Marriott School of Business at Brigham Young University. His experience design research focuses on memorable, meaningful, and transformative experiences. He also collaborates on research exploring the neurological connection between storytelling and social connection. We've had an amazing conversation exploring the breadth and depth of experience design. Tune in. Hello and welcome to Transforming Worlds. Welcome, Matt Duerden. We're excited to have you with us. How are you today?
I'm doing great. My morning, your evening, and really excited for the conversation. Thanks so much for the invite.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of my favorite subjects. So transformation design, experience design, and you've got a vast experience in these domains. So I'm feeling curious as to how this will unfold. Tell us a bit about you and your work.
So I hang out in the Department of Experience Design and Management at Brigham Young University, which is a university in the Western United States, and we're in our business school there. And so we're a unique hybrid program that we pull from design processes and social science and management, sort of mash up this interdisciplinary space and think about experiences. And that's really great for me because I see the world through an interdisciplinary lens. I've always been sort of a academic wanderer. I started as a German literature major as an undergraduate, and now I teach in a business school. But I think at the core of my nonlinear research and academic career is just a real curiosity about experiences, and especially experiences that change people. And I realized early on in my career that when you unpack experiences that impact people in transformative and meaningful and memorable ways, there's usually principles that apply across contexts and across experiences. And so that's really been a core interest of mine, is just trying to understand those generalizable principles and figure out how we can sprinkle more intentionality across more contexts and within more experiences.
So tell us more about those wonderful words: transformative, meaningful, memorable, all of them full of content.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, a lot of my research focuses in that area and has for the last, decade or so, and even longer. But I think it was about a decade ago, especially as experience as a concept just became more widely discussed because of Joe Pine and Jim Gilmore's work in the experience economy and others. So you, both in research, but also in the professional world, you just heard more chatter about every touch point with a customer should be transformative, and we only provide memorable experiences. And as a researcher, it's really hard to measure something if you can't define what it is. And I think that is the same for design, right? It's hard to design something if you can't define what it is. And so it just sort of bugged me that these terms were being sort of thrown around without really much clarity in terms of, well, what's the difference between meaningful and what's the difference between memorable? So a number of my colleagues and myself started digging into the research on memorable tourism experiences and meaningful social interactions, and anything that had sort of memorable, meaningful, and transformative in the title. And also ordinary, like there's interesting research out there on ordinary experiences. And we proposed a framework in 2018, an experience type framework, where we suggest that at the core, and we'd written some previous papers on the structure of experiences and the fact that, a bunch of people can have the same experience, and from an external observer standpoint, it's like, yes, they're all having a learning experience or a meeting experience or a shopping experience. But then you zoom in to the individual level, and you have to recognize that, yeah, there's also sort of the subjective individual reaction to the experiences that we have. And both of those are important. So everybody can have the same experience on one plane, but we're all having a different experience on another plane. And so that reaction, how we react to experiences, is probably the most important part to consider. So taking that into consideration, our framework suggests that ordinary experiences are ones where you are actively paying attention to something, and that co-creative intentional engagement is what gives rise to an experience. But these aren't necessarily sticky or long lasting. We don't remember, even though maybe we were paying attention 17 days ago to what we had for lunch, we can't necessarily recall that unless it was somehow ordinary or out of the ordinary, or something novel happened, or there's something about it that was different. So those, and most of our experiences are ordinary, which is fine, right? Like our brain conserves resources. We don't need to remember everything. But then there are a subset of extraordinary experiences, and we consider those memorable, meaningful, and transformative. So memorable, the key characteristic there is you paid attention to something, and then there's the experience has evoked emotion, and that strong emotion, that could be negative or positive, in essence sort of signals to your brain like, let's timestamp this experience and we're going to create a memory, right? The emotion creates a memory, it thus becomes memorable. Now, if there's a tension, emotion, and then the reflection on that emotion and the memory leads to some type of insight, so a tension, emotion, insight, we consider that then a meaningful experience. And if that insight about yourself or the world around you or a topic or another person, if that then becomes integrated into your attitude or your behavior or identity, we would then consider that a transformative experience. There's been some type of change in, maybe small T transformation, like my attitude changed, or a big T transformation, like an aspect of my identity or behavior has changed. And so for us, it's this hierarchy of experiences that are nested within each other, so to speak, right? And since publishing that paper in 2018, we've developed a couple of different ways to measure that framework. First, to just validate it, like, does this hold up? And it really does. If somebody says, I experienced some degree of change in experience, it's very, very rare for them, almost in all circumstances, they also are saying, yeah, there's insight and emotion, right? And so we see sort of the data validate that. We also see that if we collect, in fact, I was just looking at some data yesterday, that if I look at, because our simplest measure is we just ask people on a 1 to 10 scale, I'm paraphrasing, right? But did you experience emotion? Did you gain any insights? Did you notice change? And when we look at those scores and compare them to, say, like a net promoter score of the same experience, how likely are you to recommend this experience? That those scores sort of move up with each other, but especially meaningful and transformative. At least in our data, just to have a memorable experience doesn't necessarily facilitate affinity. There's got to be emotion and insight, and even better, emotion, insight, and change to really push people to feel like, wow, that was an experience that I would recommend to somebody else. And so a lot of the research that I do is around those concepts of ordinary, memorable, meaningful, and transformative, and trying to understand both what they are, how we measure them, and then what are sort of the levers that we can pull from a strategic design perspective to try to create opportunities for people to perceive an experience to be extraordinary. If that's our design goal, because not all experiences need to be extraordinary. Some just need to be simply ordinary.
Yeah. And have these things changed through time, or is it just that now we're learning to categorize them, qualify them, research them, and then we start giving words to something that was always there?
That's a great question, and I'll answer that in a couple of different ways, and also say from the outset, like, I don't know, right? That's a great question, but here's just some thoughts. I think first, and this isn't exactly what you were getting at, but I just want to throw out the fact that our perceptions of experiences change over time,
Yes.
right? So something that you think in the moment was like, wow, this was really transformative. From now on, I'm going to eat really healthy. And a couple of weeks down the road, like you're back to, eating potato crisps. So it just depends. And you can also have something that seems fairly ordinary become like meaningful down the road
Yeah.
too. So I think that's something to consider. I think I think there are cultural and probably over time differences in what types of experiences evoke emotion, insight, and change, right? Whether that's because of popular culture or cultural differences or just generational differences. Again, you can have a group of people all have the same experience, and it's not going to be uniform. Like this was meaningful for everybody, right? You're going to have some that it was like negatively memorable, and some it was transformative, and some it was ordinary. And so I think there are definitely differences in terms of how experiences are perceived over time, right? You can have anyway. So that's one piece of it. I do think, though, when you look at, and this is even though experience design is a relatively newly sort of synergized space, people have been thinking about experiences for a long time, right? So we can go back to Aristotle talking about eudaimonia and the good life. And he was thinking about these questions of like, what type of experiences are the best for human thriving, right? Is it just hedonic experiences of seeking things that bring pleasure? Or as he argued, no, it's about personal growth and contributing to something bigger than yourself. So I think, we can't know for sure because different research methods were used over time. But I do think there's this innate human desire to have experiences that promote progress and thriving. I just believe that's sort of core of who we are as people, that we have a desire to not just survive, but to progress and thrive. So I don't know. I really like that question, and those are some thoughts that I have, but I think it's a great sort of question to consider.
I really like how you talk about experience design as being as a term that creates synergy. So it's actually trying to find a cohesive way of gathering this concept of experience, as opposed to, of course, user experience. There's so much terminology out there, and the two get confused a lot. So when I talk about experience design in my work as a transformation designer, people automatically assume that I mean UX. I think what is transformative about your work is that you're saying, no, let's really look at experience design. So what is that, and how is it different from UX?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll give maybe sort of two perspectives on that. The way that we think about experience design, the way I think about it, and we think about it in our program, is it's a set of sort of foundational knowledge, right? Like, what are foundational thinkers and theories about experiences across disciplines and across time? Because there's a rich body of knowledge of people who have been thinking about experiences for a long time. And then upon that foundation, we think about four pillars. The first one being there's a certain paradigm that experience designers need to adopt, and seeing the world through an experience lens, recognizing sort of what we were talking about before, like at the granular level, like everything is like our sort of conscious awareness of the world is made up of individual experiences, and those experiences could think like, they're like the cell is the smallest sort of unit that we think about in terms of an organism. But even inside of a cell, there's organelles, and with an experience, I'm drawing upon Irving Goffman's work, a sociologist, that we think about like six sort of elements of experiences. So people, relationships, place, objects, rules, and blocking, and that those sort of constellations of those experience-scape elements are what we interact with when we have an experience. And then a combination of little experiences, micro experiences, then become a macro experience of a dinner out with friends, or a 4 years at university, or my 2 years at this company, or a family vacation, right? And so just viewing the world through this lens, recognizing that we live within, we navigate these ecosystems of experiences. So there's that paradigm. The second pillar is the experience design process. That there's intentional processes, how we design, stage, and manage experiences that we're conceptualizing, putting them into the real world, and then hopefully also collecting data to determine their impact. And it's sort of the cyclical process. And then the third pillar are strategies of how do you use theory and best practices to strategically sort of pull levers to say, oh, a little bit of novelty here, a little bit of perceived challenge here. And then the last one is thinking about experiential competencies. So what are the competencies that increase the likelihood that people can fully engage in experience and also more effectively extract value from their experience? So there's a lot of different ones, but for example, storytelling. So people who have higher storytelling efficacy, who can articulate stories about their experiences to themselves and others, they're likely to have a longer impact, or sort of that experience sticks with them because they're able to process it. So those pillars, then for us, that is then what experience design rests upon. And experience design is an umbrella set of knowledge and processes and competencies that then can be contextually applied to user experience or patient experience or learning experience, or whatever sort of the context is that you're designing for. And there's nuances across those different spaces and maybe different words. But ultimately, we're talking about designing experiences. And I think there's more commonality up top that sort of unites all of these subfields.
For sure. Never has there been a time like this in which narrative has become so important, right? So we're really at a change of era. And that means that we need to find sort of new ways of expressing the stories we're telling ourselves, both through the lived experience of each of us individually as the collective experience. And so it's become really, really important. I think that experience design, I started getting deeper into experience design about 10 years ago through my book, Change Ahead, which is when I started collaborating with the Chaos Pilots and, help design the curriculum for what became the experience design program there. Working
which
with
is a great program, by the way.
I love it.
Just to give a shout out to the work that Chaos Pilot does.
Indeed, and our common friend Andy Sontag, indeed, who is the big propeller of this program,
yes,
and who really started because of his own individual way of looking at the world and creating experiences for people around himself at the personal level, and then bringing it into the professional domain.
Totally. And oh, sorry, I just wanted to hop in and say with that, I think this is one of the things that I love about experience design, because it attracts people from various like industries and backgrounds, but there is often just this common like experience paradigm, right? That these are people who you like have conversations and you're like, oh yeah, we sort of see the world in the same way. And there's this natural curiosity about like what makes experiences tick and how can we think about them more intentionally. And I just love that. It's almost one of the continually like validating things for me in this work, is that you just find people who are just naturally hardwired to think about experiences, and they're looking for collaborators or experiences that they can make better. And so when I met Andy Sontag for the first time, it was a couple of minutes into the conversation and we were just like already just like having this great conversation. Or the first time I met James Wallman, who's the CEO and founder of the World Experience Organization, it was just saying like, oh, and then that he's created this space for people to gather is just so interesting. As the same, the first time I met Joe Pine, right? It's like, oh yeah, like we just have this sort of similar lens. Anyways, sorry, I interrupted, but I think
Yeah, no,
there's
but
just
those are
something
really
to that.
important names as well that you're mentioning, because I think it's you're talking about the people who are really at the forefront of experience design. And to be frank, I mean, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, because when we
Hmm.
talk about memorability, where would we be without Daniel Kahneman and the
Hmm.
experiencing self and the remembering
Yep.
self? When we talk
Yep.
about
Exactly.
meaningful experiences, where would we be without Nathan Shedroff's work and really understanding what meaning is about and how meaning making
Yep.
plays a role? But I think
Yep.
now we're at the frontier of experience design, which starts becoming about transformation, because we need a depth of experience that is different. And my take on this, and I'm curious as to how you look at it, is that as humans, we learn through experience. I mean, there's this old quote or adage from Confucianism that says, tell me and I might remember, show me and I will understand, but then when I experience it, I would really learn. And I'm quote paraphrasing horribly, sorry for that. But the concept is, when we experience, it is a lived thing. It's personal, it's intimate. There is an internal processing of the experience, and then there is the storytelling to the narrating self and to the people around us that creates virality. So you want to go tell others. And so there is this kind of interweaving of learning and experiencing, which are instrumental for transformation, particularly at a time in which we need those new narratives. We need to understand, hey, things are not entirely right. How do we make them and experience them differently? And that is so, you can't do that without integrity, because you'd experience it right back as a boomerang. If you're doing something from just a decorative point of view, then it's not
Hmm.
going to be transformative. If it's just
Yeah.
for the sake of how you're seen in the world, but it's not changing the world, then what are we doing things for
Yeah.
other than
No,
busying
I love that.
ourselves?
I love how you've articulated that, and it just like popped so many things into my head that there's this term that is escaping me right now. When you see a concept pop up independently of itself, it's sort of discovered at the same time. There's a
Mhm.
term for that, but you see again. This is why I think this like foundation, the foundational knowledge, that those that we stand upon their shoulders is the work we do as experienced designers. That you have, from a faith origin of and like worldview philosophy from Confucianism saying something, and then you have John Dewey, an American philosopher, saying similar things about like, yeah, people have to like do things to actually learn things, right? We can't, and we have to be able to like, and he talked about this idea of like coet versus inchoate experiences. So coet are ones where you pay attention to something long enough and interact with it to actually have some meaningful impact on you. And if we just spend our lives in these what he called inchoate experiences of just sort of fragmentary, and
Mm,
as I read his work and think, man, this is 120 years ago. What would he think if he saw our world now? Right, so fragmented.
yes,
We're sort of attention pulled in so many directions. I think we have more experiential opportunities than ever before, but I think that can make it even harder to have anything be transformative because
right.
it's just sort of these surface level things. And I have to back up because there's one other thing that I wanted to mention, one other person's work who I think is really helpful. And I think this could be another great guest for you down the road. But earlier this year, I was invited to read a dissertation from a student at Curtin University in Australia. Her name is Yolanda Stapleton, and she wrote her dissertation, and I should have the title memorized, but basically looked at the experience design as a field where it was different sort of disciplines from which it was emerging and what were
Mm,
the sort of next steps, right? So it's sort of this like historical view of the origin, but also like what are the complications facing the field and what does it need to do to move forward. And so we actually just had her do a session with our faculty, and it's just really interesting. And one of the things that she points out is one way to think about experience design, right? Rather than this tension between experience design and UX and service design and these different things, is is to think about experience design as a boundary object, that it is this like a gathering place, and that we can bring in sort of the best of different disciplines, but find this common ground. And we may go back to our parent discipline and do it just a little bit differently, but it creates this space of like, let's bring the best that people have and bring it together and synergize it in a way. Anyway, she just describes that concept of experience design as a boundary object in a really beautiful way, which I that's been my lived experience. It's this cool gathering place for people to come together who feel really passionate about this topic.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, I was backtracking a little bit, but I wanted to drop that in because
it's brilliant, and I think it's an important concept because we really need to bring it together so that we can understand it more in depth. And so it's also the experience we're going through as experienced designers, right?
Yeah.
It's really understanding and feeling into it to start developing language and practices together within that bounded space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Amazing. So you talked about ordinary experiences and extraordinary experiences, and you talked about the model that you've developed with the tiers and the layers. And obviously, as a transformation designer, I'm very curious about the next boundary. So where experiences become transformative. Are there things that qualify an experience in that way? And do you have examples?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think, there's so much that you can say about transformation, and there's so much to unpack there too. And so I feel like the things that I think about are just sort of like scratching the surface. And there's so many good people like yourself and others who are thinking about transformation. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that transformation as a singular experience, I think is, in my mind, is really rare. I think in terms of those moments where I have something happen and in that exact moment, I am fundamentally transformed in a lasting way. In my mind, those things happen, a handful of times in life, right? That sort of just this, like, whether it's a eureka moment or some type of like really transformative moment. For me, I think about transformation. I reference this idea of like experiential ecosystems, right? So throughout our day, we are we're navigating between a lot of ordinary touch points or micro experiences, and then we'll have some memorable, meaningful, and maybe a small transformative one thrown in over time. But I think it's more about, there's a couple ways to think about it, or that I think about it. I think there's lots of ways, but here's a couple of ways that I think about it. Yeah. I think would be interesting, and we're still trying to figure out how to study this, but my hypothesis is that there's some optimal ratio of ordinary and extraordinary experiences in our lives, right? If we have sort of too many sort of just ordinary experiences and only a small smattering of extraordinary experiences, I don't think that's great, because it just seems, well, and it seems like, or at the other end, like if we have tons of if we're having meaningful and transformative moments all the time, I think that would be exhausting as well. So I think there's some.
So in the one scenario, you don't recharge. In the other scenario, you have to be paying attention all the time, which is, they're both exhausting in different ways.
Yeah, because as you move up, I think it takes more attentional energy, and attention is a limited resource. So I think there's something about thinking about our experience portfolios that we have as individuals, and finding that sort of sweet spot of there's enough sort of change happening in our lives that's sort of driving us and helping us progress, but there's also stability. There's some really great work in the family science literature. One of my colleagues, Raymond Zabriskie, proposed this model for family experiences called the core and balance model. So we have core experiences that are just sort of routine, everyday, not like just sort of these normal everyday experiences. And those are really good for creating feelings of cohesion in a group of people, right? Because it's like I can trust that this sort of cycle of the daily routine will happen. But then we also need what he calls balance activities, which are novel, out of the ordinary, that lead to flexibility. So in a family context, this could be thought of as like a family vacation, right? If you're always going on vacation, that's not great because there's not like continuity and like, so this balance of like cohesion and adaptability, I think is interesting to think about. And so anyways, this idea of like an experience portfolio of being intentional. I've also heard this quote that I'll paraphrase incorrectly, but as we get older, we need to remember to find opportunities to be scared, right? And like if we're never doing anything scary, pushing out of our comfort zone, like we're probably not growing very,
I use one with playing, which is did we start playing because we got old, or did we get old because we stopped playing?
Yes, exactly. Same thing,
yeah?
right? So we
And
need
it's the
those
same
things.
idea.
So
Yeah, and you need to have, right, there's a sweet spot of that dynamic because, if there's change all of the time, then it's too much. So we need rituals as well to help
yes,
put us back in place and give us the opportunity to reflect. And probably, I mean,
yes,
from my point of view, I come to experience design from transformation. So I do the reverse movement.
yeah,
And I would say that all transformation is experiential.
hmm
Not all experiences are transformative, but you
yes,
cannot transform without the experience. And that's the beauty and the complexity
absolutely,
of transformation, that it requires the experience of pain.
hmm
So it's quite interesting because in transformation, the memorability in terms of peak end is not always joyful. So understanding
yep,
the necessity of change is important to be able to transform. And I think the newer
yeah,
generations are almost the opposite. Also, like they're coming at us from an opposite point of view. They live in a world of continuous change that asks so much of them, and they are now looking for places of rest, of reflection, of being
hmm
offline, and all of these rituals start appearing on the horizon as experiences for communities to really start making sense of the world, because we can make sense of the world only in experiences that are not that demanding, so that we can actually make
yes.
space for the experience of reflection.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, an analogy that I'll often discuss with my students is that if you are just focused on having experiences, it's like you're planting seeds in the ground and then moving on to the next field and planting more seeds and moving on to the next field, and you never stick around long enough to like harvest what's going to grow there. And my good friend and colleague Marcel Bastiansen, who's at Breda University, he runs their experience lab there. He and I, sort of independent of each other before we met, published papers. When we published our experience type paper, him and his colleagues published another paper about sort of the emotional impact of experiences. And we both sort of found each other at a conference in New Zealand right before COVID, and became aware of each other's work. And that's led to some really wonderful collaborations with his team and our team at BYU. And last year, or I guess this year, I went out to Braidon. We spent about a week because we said, we both wrote papers really about memorable experiences in terms of the emotional impact of experiences, and recognize that those are the most sort of immediate experiences in terms of extraordinary experiences we have. We have this emotional reaction,
Yes.
and that from our perspective, sort of meaning and transformation sort of arises over time as a result of sort of multiple experiences. And so we have a paper that should be coming out soon. It's just in its last round of review, where we wrote a conceptual paper just on meaningful experiences, and then he's coming out to visit here in Utah at my university, and we're going to write a sort of a follow-up piece focused on transformation. But in this paper that's coming out, we talk about the key. So we identified the key sort of impacts of memorable, meaningful, and transformative. But in this paper, we're talking about those plus the key processes, right? So if a memorable experience, it's remembering, right? We remember that something happened because of the emotion and the memory. A meaningful experience requires reflection, not just like recalling like this thing happened, but really unpacking it and thinking about it. And the insights are insights that are connected to, the research around meaningfulness suggests that there's different important sources of meaning, right? So if we have an insight about a social connection or something about the goals that are important to us, or making a contribution to something bigger than us, the reflection that produces those types of insights is really what leads to something being seen as meaningful. And then and then if those become integrated in sort of an identity, but I think for me, it's this sequence of experiences over time. And just to your point, like reflection is this key piece. If reflection isn't built in, there's no time for meaning making and storytelling. And that's like this key process. Like stories are how we make sense of the world around us. And I think at some point I've written up some sort of conceptual stuff that I haven't done anything yet with, but I continually think about this idea of transformative narratives or life course narratives, where I think we could unpack a lot of interesting information about what makes certain experiences more likely to be triggers for transformation by asking people to sort of explain their current identities by walking it through sort of the life timeline. Because I think when you ask somebody, tell me why you got in this particular field or why you feel this way about this thing, we usually will tell stories and say, well, like this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And something that I'm curious about is if we collected a bunch of those narratives, and people have done this to a certain degree, but then to say, okay, what is it about? Are we seeing commonalities about the type of experiences that people tend to use to explain their transformation, right? Like, what is it about these sort of transformative, like when we think about transformative narratives, what are characteristics of experiences, the types of experiences we continually see pop up, right? Because, we've all experienced countless experiences, but when we explain ourselves to others and our attitudes and our identities, we draw upon like, well, this thing happened, this conversation, I had this experience.
You connect the dots for one another.
Yeah, we connect those dots. And what is it about those experiences that we use to tell those stories? Are there commonalities? Anyways,
my guess is that there's a huge emotional element to that. So typically when people recount stories, we use the idea of post-rationalization. So we explain ourselves to ourselves, and in hindsight, of course, we're perfectly rational and we do all logical things. But the interesting thing about when something is really memorable and transformative is that it's more guided by the emotion in the process than the actual steps.
Love that.
So it doesn't have any particular sequential logic. It takes you from different emotional states, and it's a change of state that makes it transformative, because then you can organize it in ways that make new sense of the world, which you couldn't have before. So by definition, when you transform, you don't know what's going to happen, and the transformed self can't go back to the way it was. So using logic to tell those stories wouldn't work, because argumentatively, you can't go from one level of thinking to the next. And the bridge has to be emotion, has to be metaphor, has to be sharing, compassion, all of these elements which have an experiential nature in them per se, because there is no transformation without experience. Even if it's you're walking alone in the forest and you suddenly realize that life is beautiful, there is this connection that makes it shareable in the transformation, and sort of this deep insight that you talked about that appears then.
Well, and this makes me think too, like going back to this idea of experiential competencies, that if you could have, again, 10 people go through the same experience and have 3 of them have feel it was transformative and the others not. And like, what are the sort of the individual characteristics that allow that to happen, right? And I do think, there's a lot of variability when we're talking about human behavior, but I do think there's things that, so I've taught for 3 years this class called The Art of Transformative Storytelling, with a good friend of mine who's an English professor. And there's, anyway, this whole backstory of how we got to teaching this class, but it was really driven by this hypothesis that if we can teach students how to be better storytellers about their experiences, it's going to increase the likelihood of them being more open to transformation down the road, and also unpack more transformation from the experiences that we've had. And the success of that class and the experiences that students have had in that class, this is with Dr. Jamin Rowan, that's led us down this path of doing research with colleagues of mine that study human connection, Camilla Hodge, and then Dan Dewey, who's a linguistic neuroscientist, where we're looking at the neuroscience behind people telling and listening to stories, which has been done before, but we're using what are called functional near-infrared spectroscopy devices, which are in essence like portable. I know I had to practice a long time to say that. So FNIRS devices. So you have fMRI, where you stick somebody in a tube and measure their neurological functioning, and FNIRS devices, where they put a cap on and have a little backpack. So we can have somebody standing telling a story, and then listeners with the same devices on, so we can look at how their brain patterns sort of compare to each other. And what we see with storytelling is that a variety of things, and we're still unpacking this. We're about a year into this research, but the model that we sort of look at is this idea that stories are about, I have some type of need, I face complications in trying to have that need met, and then I learn something through that process, right? So we sort of timestamp needs, complications, and insights while people are telling stories. And it's this part when they get to the insight of saying, like, this happened, I did all of this stuff, and this is what I learned, that moment is when what's called neural coupling or neural synchronicity happens most strongly, where people really are like firing on the same neural pathways. And there's this sense of like human connection of like, I haven't gone through that experience, but your insight, like I can see how that like applies to my experiences, and it like draws us together. And so I think there's this piece of transformation that we often think of it at an individual level, but through storytelling. And you noted this already in our conversation, that through storytelling, it can lead to group transformation, right?
Yeah.
And so, anyways, just another level of like,
that's super powerful and so important, because back in the day, probably until yesterday, maybe a few minutes ago, the ones that were doing the design of experiences were brands and the advertisers, but the ones that are unpacking the experiences are real human beings. And I think we're at a turning point in which we're understanding the power of storytelling and experience design at the community level and at the level of sharing. And the unpacking necessitates compassion, which from Latin means with or com, and passion, it has actually 3 words in it: pain, patience, and indeed passion. So it's really about co-experiencing, isn't it? What you've just described. And this almost magical, fantastical, telepathic capacity is not going through our brains. It's going through our bodies. It's going through our hearts and through our tummies and through the sharing, because through the narrative, through the storytelling, we become one with the story as if it were happening to us. And that's absolutely magical in your research. I'm really curious as to where that will bring us in the future, right? So does this bring people with not such nice intentions in a position to manipulate stories more? Or do we start really embracing our humanity and realizing that what we feel should dictate much more of how we go through the world, and not just going through the motions, right? So being much more embodied in our experiences, not necessarily having to do it with intensity, just being there.
Yeah, I love how you've articulated that. I mean, we know the research shows that proximity breaks down tribalism and polarity, right? But when you come to understand somebody else's story, suddenly the stereotypes sort of fall away, right? And it just makes me think about also the power of in-person shared experiences. And there are great things that we can do with technology to connect across the ocean and have this conversation right now, which is amazing. But I do worry about, if we were just to shift everything to sort of virtual and digital and sort of in our own sort of echo chamber experiences, it just breaks down like how human society has been built, and it's about coming together and sharing stories and this process of like unpacking life together. There's real power in doing that and learning from each other's stories. But if we are having if we're just having sort of these disjointed experiences and our intention is going everywhere all the time, not only do we not have the ability to like unpack and understand and reflect and articulate what's happening to ourselves, like those stories, if we never generate them, they can't bless and enrich other people. And then that is problematic, as opposed to living in ways where we're having experiences and we have the ability to reflect and we have opportunities to share. That becomes like powerful community transformation building stuff.
Yes, that is joyful to hear. I mean, it's really beautiful. It is. It's so basic and essential, and we seem to have forgotten. Yeah. So if we were to forward in time, say 5, 10, 20 years in time, and we live in a society that is transformed by its experiences, what might that world look like?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think living in a world that's more intentional in terms of thinking about, there's so many systems currently set up that make things easier for us, which is good. But you've talked about the importance of like challenge and pain and struggle, right? But I think there's this idea of volition, that we should be making choices about the experiences that we have. And so if because the next show pops up on Netflix or whatever service I'm using, and I finish one show and it says, hey, the next one's starting in 5 seconds, like it's pretty hard to like push back and not just want to like watch the next thing. So I think we have to live in a world where we're making more volitional choices than just addictive choices, right? Like making intentional choices about what we're doing, as opposed to like, I love the dopamine boost that I get from checking notifications or things on here. I think also living in a world where we are taking time to reflect and unpack our experiences, and that there's opportunities to sort of share and talk about those. Because I've done research. A big chunk of my early research, 15, 20 years ago, was looking at international immersion experiences. And one of the things that we saw when we were doing, especially the qualitative data, because we'd ask, these are usually adolescents, how often are you reflecting on the experiences that you had? And we had them sort of, note empirically, like, oh, I'm doing this and I'm talking to people. And so we knew that just the more reflection, the longer outcomes were sustained. But also when we talked to people, you had, I remember distinctly like kids who came home so excited to talk about what they'd learned about rainforest deforestation or culture in Peru or wherever they were traveling, and had these transformative experiences, but then go home and their friends just wanted to talk about the latest video game they got or some movie they'd seen, and they just didn't feel like they had anybody who wanted to hear their stories. And so I think we have to think about, thinking forward in communities, I think transformative communities have opportunities where people are intentionally making decisions about the experiences they're having, and that they have the competencies to sort of unpack and reflect on those. but there's also good story listeners in those communities, people who are willing to just stop and hear other people's stories, as opposed to just like interject, argue against, move on to the next thing. So I think it's communities of storytellers and listeners that's part of that sort of community that you're envisioning.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's actually the reason why I do this podcast. So I'm an author and a public speaker, and I find it very important to have spaces where I listen.
Yeah, I
Which
love it.
is,
And you are a really good conversation leader and listener. It's really
thank
delightful
you.
chatting with you.
Thank you. So I have one last question for you, and it's one that you're used to as a researcher and academics. This is a question that always appears. What will be the next question?
Something that's on my mind. Well, I have lots of questions. I'm like distracted by all shiny objects, and so I tend to like have too many things going on. But in relevance to this conversation, we talked earlier. I can't remember if it was before we officially started the podcast or not. But this idea of co-creation, right? So that all experiences are co-created. If somebody, as an experience, I do a lot of learning experience design as a teacher, right? So I could design what I think is an amazing class, but if the students are on their phones or having sidebar conversations, they're not having the experience that I was hoping they would have. We're not co-creating it, right? There's got to be co-creation. What I'm really interested in is so I think about experiences in terms of the anticipation, participation, and reflection phases. And a lot of times our design focuses on that participation phase, which is important, but also thinking about how do we help prepare people for an experience so they can engage most in meaningful ways, and then what happens when people leave the experience. And so instead of co-creation, sort of the flavor of that I think can happen in the reflection phase is co-curation, right? So how do we help as an experienced designer, right, help people co-curate their memories and their stories after the experience, right? So you were referencing earlier, like, man, if it's just sort of the brands designing these experiences and sort of just saying, like, handing it off in a very sort of commodity type way, that's an issue. But I think there's this opportunity to also, for whoever is designing the experiences, to think, how do we help people curate the memories that they walk away with this experience from? We did the best job and we provided a great experience and there was emotion and insight and change. But when you go home, when you leave an experience, it's not a guarantee that it's going to stick, right? Sometimes I think about it's like, if in the US, if you're traveling I live in Utah, and if I travel to California, there's usually agricultural checkpoints at the border, because California is where the US grows a lot of its produce, right? And so they don't want outside pests coming in. So if you have any citrus fruit on you or certain things, they just take it from you at the border, right? Because they don't want it in. So I've often been with my family pulling up and like, everybody eat all the stuff we have because it's going to be taken away from us. But I think it's similar when we have an experience, like we almost have to go through this border crossing when we leave an experience and go back from this extraordinary world into our ordinary world. Like sometimes we can't figure out how to take stuff home with us, right? Because we're back in sort of the rush of our lives, or we don't have people to talk to, or there's not. So how do we help people co-curate what they take, the memories that they take from the experiences that we design? So that's something that is of interest to me.
Yeah. So Andy and I wrote a paper about the 5E model, and the last E of experience design is extension. And it's really about this. We're going to add that to the show notes. And we're also going to add to the show notes how people can find you. So where can they find you and your work?
So I think LinkedIn is where I don't do much. I don't do really any social media besides LinkedIn, because it's a great way to connect with people. So people can just find me, Matt Duerden, on there. My most sort of accessible work is designing experiences that I co-wrote with Bob Rossman. So you can find that through lots of, whether it's Amazon or other outlets. Currently, it's been translated into Russian and Chinese, and soon it will be translated into Portuguese, which we're excited about. And then Yeah, I love having conversations with people. So I think the connections between, I mean, I'll just tell a quick story. So, but when I was going to, I've taught a couple of semesters in London because our university has a residential center in London. So I run a program with Jamin Rowan, who I referenced earlier,
Yes.
on curiosity and creativity in London. And the first time I went, I emailed Joe Pine, who's always just been a gracious mentor and friend, and said, "Hey, Joe, who should I meet in London?" Right? I know there's a lot of interesting, experienced thinkers. So he gave me this big list, and this was January 2020. So I didn't make it all through the list because the pandemic happened and had to go back home. But through that list, I met James Wallman, and I met other people. But one of the individuals I met was Scott Gould, and we didn't meet in person, but we had some Zoom calls, and then I don't know, last year about this time, Scott and I reconnected and we were talking about some stuff. And he's like, "Do you know Andy Sontag?" And I'm like, I've heard of Chaos Pilot. I don't know Andy. So he connected me to Andy, and was able to come out and participate in the Chaos Pilot Experience Design Program at the beginning of this year. And that's how sort of we met. And so I think there's just a lot of value in having conversations with people and just making those connections and who do they know and things. So I'm always up for just chatting with people.
Conversations are also experiences, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us and for all of the wisdom that you've shared. We're all learning. So it's really beautiful to see experience design continuing to develop and to be and better understood thanks to your work amongst that of many others that we've mentioned today. It's been really lovely speaking to you, and I've learned a lot. So thank you so much.
Oh, likewise. You're such a gracious host, and just I can tell just a naturally curious person. So I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.